In the summer of 1924, 5 gold prospectors ventured into the shadowed wilderness of Mount St. Helens in Washington state.
Their goal was simple: to strike it rich at the Vander White Mine, a claim nestled deep within an isolated gorge. The men, Fred Beck, Marion Smith, Roy Smith, Marion's son, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson, built a modest log cabin to serve as their base. It was sturdy, with walls thick enough to withstand the elements, or so they thought. The isolation of the area was part of its appeal, but as they would soon discover, the wilderness was not empty. The miners' troubles began subtly. Each night, strange whistling sounds echoed from ridge to ridge. An unnatural melody carried on the wind. At first, they dismissed it as the call of some nocturnal animal, but as the days passed, the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, almost conversational. Then there were the thuds, low, resonant booms like something heavy striking a hollow log. These noises came from no discernible direction, their origins shrouded in the dense forest that surrounded the cabin. The men's unease deepened when they discovered footprints near their claim. They were massive, measuring nearly 14 inches in length and pressed deep into the soil. No ordinary animal could have left such marks, and the shape was disturbingly human-like.
"Could be a bear," Marion suggested, though his voice betrayed doubt. None of the men had ever seen bear tracks like these. The encounter one afternoon, Fred Beck and Marion Smith ventured to a nearby spring to fetch water. The dense forest pressed close, the towering pines muffling all sound but the crunch of their boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. As they approached the spring, something moved in the corner of Fred's vision. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. There, partially obscured by a tree, stood a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair. Its shoulders were broad, its arms disproportionately long, and its eyes glinted with a piercing intelligence that sent a shiver down Fred's spine. "Marion," Fred whispered, but Marion had already seen it. Without hesitation, he raised his rifle and fired. The shot cracked through the air, and the creature recoiled, disappearing into the undergrowth with an inhuman scream. The 2 men stood frozen for a moment before sprinting back to the cabin, their water forgotten. When they told the others what they had seen, skepticism gave way to unease. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal they could identify, and it was close. The first attack that night, as darkness fell, the men decided to leave at first light. But the forest had other plans. Around midnight, a thunderous crash against the cabin wall jolted them awake. Gabe scrambled for his rifle as another impact shook the cabin. "What's happening?" Roy shouted, his voice tinged with panic. Outside, heavy footsteps circled the structure, accompanied by guttural growls that sounded almost language-like. Then came the rocks. Fist-sized stones rained down on the cabin, striking the roof and walls with alarming force. The men could hear them bouncing off the timber, the thuds reverberating in the confined space. "They're trying to break in!" Fred yelled as something slammed against the door. Through a small gap in the logs, Roy caught a glimpse of one of the creatures. It was enormous, its face framed by shaggy hair, its glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. The beast's mouth opened, revealing sharp yellowed teeth as it let out a deep, guttural roar. Marion fired his rifle, the muzzle flash illuminating the room for an instant. Outside, the creature howled in pain but didn't retreat. The assault continued for hours. The creatures, there were at least 3, maybe more, circled the cabin, pounding on the walls and hurling rocks. At one point, a massive clawed hand reached through a gap in the logs, groping for the axe left near the doorway. Gabe lunged forward, grabbing the axe just as Marion fired another shot. The hand withdrew, leaving deep gouges in the wood. A night of terror. The men's rifles became their lifeline. Each time a creature came too close, they fired, the deafening cracks momentarily driving the beast back. But the ammunition was limited, and the creatures seemed relentless. Their growls and howls filled the night, a cacophony of primal rage and chilling determination. Fred risked a glance through another gap in the wall. He saw one of the creatures standing just a few feet away, illuminated by the pale moonlight. Its chest heaved with labored breaths, and its eyes glinted with what Fred could only describe as malice. He swore it grinned before letting out a bone-chilling scream and slamming its massive fist against the wall. Inside, the men were frantic. "We can't keep this up," Gabe muttered, his hands trembling as he reloaded his rifle. "They'll tear us apart." "Not if we make it till dawn," Marion replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Hours crawled by, each second feeling like an eternity. The attacks ebbed and flowed, as if the creatures were testing the cabin's defenses. The men fired intermittently, conserving their ammunition and praying that morning would bring salvation. Escape at dawn. As the first light of dawn seeped through the forest, the attack ceased. The silence was deafening, broken only by the heavy breathing of the men and the occasional creak of the battered cabin. Slowly, cautiously, they emerged. The scene outside was one of chaos. The ground was littered with rocks, and massive footprints crisscrossed the area. One side of the cabin had been nearly torn apart, with strips of wood hanging precariously. The men scanned the forest, rifles at the ready, but saw no sign of their attackers. As they prepared to leave, Fred noticed movement near the edge of the gorge. One of the creatures stood there, watching them. Its massive frame was silhouetted against the rising sun. Fred raised his rifle, his hand steady despite the fear coursing through him. He fired 3 shots. The last one hit its mark, and the creature toppled backward, disappearing into the chasm below. The men didn't wait to see if it would return. They fled, abandoning their claim and trekking to Spirit Lake, where they reported their ordeal to a ranger.
Their story spread quickly, capturing the public's imagination and sparking what became known as the Great Ape Hunt of 1924. The aftermath skeptics dismissed the miner's tale as a fabrication, a desperate attempt to cover for an abandoned claim. Others suggested the footprints and attacks might have been staged, but those who ventured into the area reported an unsettling atmosphere, as if the forest itself remembered the events of that night. Fred Beck later claimed that the creatures were not mere animals, but supernatural entities, something beyond human understanding. They were something from another world, he wrote in his memoirs. They were not flesh and blood like we know it. In 1980, the eruption of Mount St. Helens obliterated much of the area, erasing the physical remnants of the cabin and the mine.
But the story of Ape Canyon endures, a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking in the wilderness. To this day, those who hike near Mount St. Helens speak in hushed tones of strange sounds and shadowy figures, as if the creatures, or their descendants, still roam the forest, waiting for another chance to make themselves known.